History, they say, is written by the winners. But what if part of that narrative was carefully shaped to serve political, religious, and economic interests? What if behind the textbooks there existed a hidden world of distorted events, silenced truths, and facts buried under the weight of time? Welcome to a journey through the hidden side of history, the one not taught in schools, the one that challenges common sense and questions what we believe to be true. This video does not seek to rewrite history, but to uncover it, revealing facts that have been ignored, suppressed, or conveniently distorted. Each chapter of this video delves into a controversial historical episode, bringing to light forgotten documents, alternative versions, and interpretations that challenge established truths. The goal is not to convince, but to provoke reflection. For as George Orwell once said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." 10th fact, Nazism and the support of major corporations. Nazism, often portrayed as an isolated aberration in history, was in reality a complex phenomenon involving global economic interests. Beyond its extreme racial ideology, the Nazi regime received support from major international corporations that profited from the war and the exploitation of enslaved labor. Adolf Hitler's rise to power did not occur in a vacuum. From its early days, the Nazi Party received funding from both German and foreign businessmen who were interested in a strong, rearmed Germany. Among these were industrial giants that provided technology, equipment, and financial investments. Corporations such as IG Farben, Siemens, and Krupp played essential roles in Nazi infrastructure. IG Farben, for instance, not only produced war materials but was also responsible for manufacturing Zyklon B gas, which was used in the extermination chambers of concentration camps. Although the United States positioned itself as an enemy of the Axis during World War II, some of its largest corporations maintained business ties with Nazi Germany before and even during the conflict. Ford, for example, operated factories in German territory, supplying vehicles for the regime. IBM collaborated with the Nazi government in developing cataloging and tracking systems for the Jewish population, facilitating the logistics of the Holocaust. Another notorious case was Standard Oil, now ExxonMobil, which provided essential technology for the production of synthetic fuels, enabling the Nazi war machine to continue operating despite the oil blockade imposed by the Allies. While millions perished on the battlefields and in the gas chambers, some companies amassed astronomical profits. The relationship between major corporations and the Nazi regime was not merely a matter of economic pragmatism, but in some cases also of ideological affinity. Businessmen feared the specter of communism and saw Nazism as a force capable of containing this threat, ensuring a business-friendly environment. After the war, many of these companies avoided severe consequences. Some were investigated, but most continued operating as usual, with some even benefiting from the Marshall Plan in the reconstruction of Europe. Nazism was not a monster born in isolation. It was fueled by an economic system that, in pursuit of profit and power, turned a blind eye to the horrors it helped sustain. Official history often paints Hitler as a deranged dictator, but rarely mentions the corporate machinery that allowed his regime to flourish. World War II was undoubtedly one of humanity's most tragic events. However, behind the rhetoric of justice and freedom, there were those who saw war as nothing more than another business opportunity. And that is a lesson in history that few are willing to teach. 9th fact, the true history of the discovery of America. The official narrative teaches us that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. However, this version of events ignores archaeological evidence, alternative historical accounts, and the political interests behind this so-called discovery. To understand the real history of the American continent, we must travel far before the arrival of the Europeans and examine the civilizations that flourished for millennia before the Spanish ships appeared. Long before Columbus, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had already built grand empires, erected impressive cities, and developed advanced political and social systems. The Maya, Aztecs, and Incas are some of the most well-known civilizations, but countless others thrived in different regions of the continent. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans arrived in the Americas at least 20,000 years ago, either by crossing the Bering Land Bridge or navigating unknown routes. Peoples such as the Clovis, the Anasazi, and the Tupi-Guarani shaped the destiny of the Americas long before any Europeans set foot on this land. Traditional history teaches that Europeans were the first to reach America, but there are indications that Vikings, Chinese, and even Africans may have visited the continent before Columbus. The expedition of Leif Erikson, dated around the year 1000 AD, is believed to have reached a region known as Vinland in what is now Canada. Furthermore, enigmatic maps like the Piri Reis map, dating back to the 16th century, depict details of the American coastline even before its official discovery. These clues suggest that transatlantic navigation may have occurred much earlier than we assume. Columbus's arrival in America was not an isolated act of bravery and exploration, but a political and economic movement driven by the need to expand markets and consolidate power. Spain, eager for new riches, funded Columbus's expedition in hopes of finding gold and opening new trade routes. However, this discovery brought with it a dark legacy. The genocide of indigenous peoples, slavery, and the imposition of a new social order were direct consequences of colonization. The history we are told is one of bravery and heroism, but the reality was marked by blood and suffering. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. He was merely another character in a much older, more complex story filled with hidden interests. The true history of America is that of the peoples who inhabited it for millennia, the cultures that flourished, and the secrets that still await discovery. History is not fixed. It is a living organism shaped by those who tell it. And it is up to us to question, investigate, and seek the truth beyond the official versions. Eighth fact, the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is often depicted as a period of absolute terror, filled with sadistic tortures, religious persecutions, and blazing pyres burning endlessly. But to what extent does this image align with reality? Was the Inquisition truly as brutal as popular history teaches us, or are there overlooked aspects to this narrative? At the end of the 15th century, Spain was undergoing intense transformation. With the unification of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and the reconquest of territories previously ruled by the Moors, the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand sought to consolidate their power. In 1478, with the approval of Pope Sixtus IV, the Spanish Inquisition was established, an institution that, unlike its predecessors, was under the direct control of the monarchy rather than the church. Its declared goal was to preserve Catholic orthodoxy in a newly unified country by eliminating heretics and false converts, particularly Jews and Muslims who, after being forced to convert to Christianity, were suspected of secretly practicing their original religions. One of the greatest myths about the Spanish Inquisition is that millions of people were brutally tortured and executed. In reality, historical records indicate that over its 350-year existence, around 150,000 people were prosecuted, of whom approximately 3,000 to 5,000 were executed. Torture, though present, was used in a minority of cases and was regulated with limitations on time and severity. Methods such as the toca, a primitive form of waterboarding, were employed, but many of the grotesque images associated with the Inquisition stem from Protestant and Enlightenment-era propaganda in the 18th century, aimed at demonizing the institution. More than just a tool of religious repression, the Inquisition served as a political instrument for Spanish monarchs. It was used to eliminate opponents, consolidate royal power, and strengthen national identity under the banner of Catholicism. Those accused of heresy were often political enemies or figures seen as threats to the status quo. Additionally, the Inquisition played a significant economic role. Many of those convicted had their properties confiscated, directly benefiting the crown and the Spanish elite. Thus, the fear of the Inquisition also functioned as a mechanism of social and financial control. The main targets of the Inquisition were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, Moriscos, Muslims who had converted, and Protestants. Scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals were also persecuted, though in smaller numbers than commonly believed. One of the most famous cases was that of the astronomer Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600. But it is important to note that this event occurred under the Roman Inquisition, not the Spanish one. Another well-known case was Miguel Servet, a theologian and scientist persecuted by both the Spanish Inquisition and Calvinists in Switzerland. He was ultimately executed for heresy in Geneva under the orders of John Calvin. With the rise of Enlightenment ideas in the 18th century and the weakening of the Church's power, the Inquisition began to decline. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte abolished the Inquisition in Spain, but it was briefly reinstated after his fall. It was only in 1834, with the advance of liberalism, that the Spanish Inquisition was officially dissolved. Its legacy, however, remains a subject of debate. For some, it was an instrument of religious terror and oppression. For others, it was less violent than Protestant propaganda suggested, and in some ways reflected the political dynamics of its time. The Spanish Inquisition was undoubtedly a dark chapter in history, but not as monstrous as some popular portrayals suggest. As always, historical truth is more complex than the myths that surround it. The reality lies in the details, and it is up to us to examine them carefully before passing judgment on the events of the past. Seventh fact, the dark secrets of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is often remembered as a symbol of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but behind the Enlightenment ideals, there were conspiracies, manipulations, and hidden interests that shaped the fate of France and the world. 18th century France was a powder keg ready to explode. While the nobility indulged in excessive luxury, the population suffered from hunger, exorbitant taxes, and extreme inequality. The people demanded change, but their uprising may have been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game of interests. It is believed that secret societies, such as the Illuminati of Bavaria, played a crucial role in the events leading to the revolution. Some historians suggest that international bankers and influential figures helped finance the uprising to destabilize the monarchy and gain control over the French economy. After the fall of the Bastille, the revolution descended into chaos. The Reign of Terror, led by Robespierre, became an execution machine, eliminating not only nobles, but also revolutionaries deemed undesirable. But was this terror truly necessary, or was it part of a larger plan to consolidate power? The French Revolution was not merely a popular movement. It was also a war of narratives, where truth blended with propaganda and hidden interests shaped the course of history. The revolutionary ideal was noble, but the paths that led to it were shadowed by secrecy. Who really benefited from the French Revolution? Sixth fact, the enigma of the Maya collapse. The Maya, one of the most fascinating civilizations of Central America, built grand cities, developed a complex writing system, and created a calendar that still amazes us today. However, around the 9th century, their cities began to be abandoned. What could have happened to this vibrant empire? Was it war, famine, climate change, or something more mysterious? Between the 3rd and 9th centuries, the Maya civilization flourished, spreading across regions that today correspond to Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The Maya mastered astronomy, mathematics, and architecture, leaving behind a legacy of magnificent temples and cities such as Tikal, Palenque, and Copan. However, by the late 9th century, much of these cities were abandoned, plunging the Maya world into an enigma that persists to this day. One of the most accepted theories for the Maya collapse is that a severe drought lasting for decades led to their downfall. Scientific studies analyzing lake sediments near ancient Maya cities found evidence of a drastic reduction in rainfall. Without water for agriculture and to sustain a growing population, the civilization may have collapsed. Archaeological records indicate that the Maya had sophisticated water collection systems, but these may not have been enough to withstand such a prolonged drought. As a result, famine and thirst could have triggered mass migrations, leading to the abandonment of cities. Another theory suggests that Maya city-states engaged in successive wars, weakening each other. Inscriptions on stone stelae indicate conflicts between different Maya kingdoms. Rivalries between cities may have led to political collapse, making urban life unsustainable. With leaders constantly fighting for power and resources dwindling, the Maya may have been victims of their own internal fragmentation. The collapse was likely not sudden, but rather a gradual decline that culminated in the dispersion of the population. Rapid population growth may have led to the overexploitation of natural resources. Deforestation for agriculture and the burning of wood to produce lime for Maya construction could have contributed to irreversible environmental changes, with fewer trees to retain moisture and keep the soil fertile. Food production may have declined, worsening the crisis. Some researchers propose that other civilizations or invaders may have played a role in the Maya collapse. Although there is no direct evidence of a major external invasion, the arrival of the Toltecs in the Maya territory may have destabilized society. Additionally, epidemics brought by external contacts could have decimated part of the population. Despite the collapse of its great cities, Maya culture did not disappear. Many descendants of the ancient Maya still live in the region and maintain ancestral traditions. The Maya language is still spoken, and their cultural identity persists, proving that, while the empire may have fallen, its spirit survives. The mystery of the Maya collapse continues to fascinate historians and archaeologists, and new discoveries may bring unexpected answers. But perhaps we will never know for sure what happened. Like many other civilizations throughout history, the Maya remind us that even the most brilliant empires can vanish, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions. Fifth fact, the manipulation of history by the Catholic Church. Since the dawn of Western civilization, the Catholic Church has wielded unparalleled power over the course of history. Its influence was not limited to faith and spirituality, but extended over kings and empires, dictating laws, censoring knowledge, and shaping the way the world saw itself. However, there is a darker side to this history, where events were carefully edited to serve the institution's interests. For centuries, the church was the guardian of knowledge, deciding what could be read and studied. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest repositories of ancient wisdom, was destroyed, and many believe that part of this destruction was aimed at preventing ideas contrary to Christian faith from spreading. Later, the Inquisition persecuted intellectuals and scientists whose discoveries challenged religious narratives. Works containing knowledge about astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were condemned to the flames, and thinkers like Giordano Bruno paid with their lives for defying the church's imposed worldview. The Gospels that make up the Bible today were carefully selected by the church, while many other accounts of Jesus' life and teachings were deemed heretical and eliminated. The Gnostic Gospels, for example, presented a more mystical and philosophical interpretation of Christianity, but they were banned and forgotten for centuries. The Council of Nicaea in the 4th century established the dogmas of Christian faith and consolidated the church's structure as a political and religious institution. Those who disagreed were labeled heretics and mercilessly persecuted. The Inquisition was one of the darkest chapters of this historical manipulation. Created to combat heresy, it functioned as a machine of repression, torture, and censorship. Thousands were executed under weak accusations, often driven by political and economic interests. Science, philosophy, and even art fell victim to the church's control and censorship. Galileo Galilei, for instance, was forced to renounce his astronomical discoveries to avoid being burned at the stake. The church also played a crucial role in the colonization of the Americas and the enslavement of indigenous and African peoples. With papal approval, European conquerors subjugated entire civilizations in the name of God. The papal bull Dum Diversas, 1452, authorized the enslavement of non-Christians, justifying centuries of exploitation and violence. The forced imposition of Christianity erased entire cultures, replacing ancestral beliefs with a faith imposed through iron and fire. Missionaries acted as agents of conversion, often serving the interests of colonizers. In recent centuries, the church has attempted to distance itself from its historical mistakes. Apologies have been issued for the treatment of scientists like Galileo and for the atrocities of the Inquisition. However, the marks left by this manipulation of history still echo in modern society. The Catholic Church shaped history in ways far beyond religion. Its power to censor, influence over kings and empires, and ability to rewrite narratives left deep scars on Western civilization. Today, with greater access to information, we can look at the past with a critical eye and question official versions of events. History, after all, does not belong to a single institution. It is a mosaic of voices, many of which were silenced. Now, it is up to us to recover them. Fourth fact, the truth behind Brazil's independence. Brazil's independence is often portrayed as a heroic and spontaneous act by Dom Pedro III, who, on the banks of the Ipiranga River, proclaimed the nation's separation from Portugal with a cry for freedom. However, the reality of this rupture is far more complex, filled with political interests, betrayals, and external influences that are rarely mentioned in textbooks. Contrary to popular belief, Brazil's independence was not the result of a popular uprising against colonial oppression. In fact, it was a process led by the agrarian and commercial elite, who sought to secure their privileges in response to the changes occurring in Europe and neighboring colonies. The arrival of the Portuguese royal family in Brazil in 1808 had already transformed the colony into the seat of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil was no longer just a source of exploitation, but had become a crucial administrative and economic center for the Portuguese crown. As a result, many Brazilian merchants began to profit from this new status, creating an economic bond that made separation a delicate matter. England, the greatest maritime and commercial power of the time, played a crucial role in Brazil's independence. Since the Methuen Treaty in the 18th century, Portugal had been economically dependent on Britain, and this reliance only grew when Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. When the independence movement gained momentum, England saw a golden opportunity, ensuring that Brazil became an independent nation while remaining economically subordinate to British interests. To achieve this, Britain provided diplomatic support and mediated negotiations between Portugal and Brazil, ensuring that its commercial influence remained intact. Although Dom Pedro I was the central figure of independence, he was not a revolutionary in the classic sense. He hesitated to fully break with Portugal, and for a long time sought a solution that would keep his family in power on both sides of the Atlantic. It was only when he realized that the Brazilian elite would no longer accept Portuguese rule and that separation was inevitable that he proclaimed independence. But he did so with guarantees that his his interests and those of his family would not be harmed. While independence was largely an agreement between the Brazilian elite and Portugal, several popular movements fought for true emancipation. Revolts such as the Bahian Conspiracy and the Pernambucan Revolution had already shown that the people longed for profound change, not just a change of rulers. However, these revolts were brutally repressed, and their leaders were either executed or erased from official history. The way independence was conducted ensured that power remained in the hands of the aristocracy, perpetuating inequalities that still resonate today. Brazil's independence was not an isolated act of heroism, but a complex process, influenced by internal and external economic and political interests. The country was born independent, yet its power structure remained virtually unchanged, with the same dominant groups leading the nation. Understanding this reality allows us to see how the roots of inequality and power concentration were planted in the earliest days of our history as a nation. It is up to us to question the past and strive for a future where independence truly belongs to all. Third fact, the dark role of the great powers in Africa. Africa, a vast continent rich in natural resources, has been exploited and manipulated by foreign powers for centuries. European colonialism not only plundered its wealth, but also redrew artificial borders, sowed conflicts, and perpetuated a system of dependence that still shapes much of Africa's reality today. When the Europeans arrived in Africa, they did not come as partners, but as predators. The continent was arbitrarily divided during the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, where powers like the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, and Portugal decided among themselves how to exploit territories that never belonged to them. African peoples were subjugated, their lands seized, and their riches extracted to enrich foreign nations. Gold, diamonds, oil, and other resources were taken from Africa on an absurd scale. Multinational corporations, many of which still operate today, played a central role in this looting, profiting from corrupt regimes and the misery of local populations. With decolonization in the 20th century, the continent should have moved toward autonomy and progress. However, foreign powers continued to interfere in African governments, ensuring that leaders who served their interests remained in power. Whenever a nationalist leader emerged, threatening to cut ties with exploitative systems, he was either overthrown or assassinated. A key example is Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, who sought true independence free from European influence. He was brutally murdered in a conspiracy involving Belgium and the CIA. Similarly, coups d'etat and civil wars were deliberately encouraged to keep power in the hands of Western-backed elites. The global perception of Africa as a continent doomed to poverty and chaos is not accidental. It is part of a global system that maintains this condition. International organizations, banks, and corporations impose harsh conditions on investments and loans, preventing true economic development. The imposition of unpayable debts, the destruction of local economies through unfair trade agreements, and the funding of internal conflicts keep the continent trapped in a neo-colonial structure. Meanwhile, foreign corporations continue to exploit natural resources and cheap labor. Africa is not poor due to a lack of resources or capability, but because it has been systematically exploited and sabotaged for centuries. The great powers which once ruled through direct colonialism now control the continent through economics, politics, and indirect military influence. Africa's future depends on breaking this cycle of domination, reclaiming its sovereignty, and demanding historical reparations. Until the world acknowledges its role in this ongoing suffering, Africa will remain a symbol of resistance, but also of a historical injustice that still needs to be corrected. Second fact, the farce of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is often portrayed as an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, a fight for freedom against the advance of the Red Dictatorship. However, the reality behind this bloody war is far darker than what textbooks tell us. The trigger for the Vietnam War was a manufactured incident. The so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 was the justification the United States used to plunge headfirst into the conflict. According to the official version, U.S. ships were attacked by Vietnamese forces, but years later, declassified documents revealed that the attack never happened. It was a hoax, a fabricated excuse to justify the military escalation in Southeast Asia. If communism was indeed a threat, why did the United States choose Vietnam as its main battlefield? The answer lies in the economic and geopolitical interests of the time. Southeast Asia was a strategic region, full of valuable natural resources. Controlling Vietnam would allow the United States to consolidate its influence in the region and contain the advance of China and the Soviet Union. Arms companies profited billions from the conflict, while thousands of young American soldiers were sent to die in a meaningless war. For the war moguls, Vietnam was a profitable business, and the lives lost in the process mattered little. What few speak of regarding the Vietnam War are the war crimes committed by American troops. The My Lai massacre, where hundreds of Vietnamese civilians were brutally murdered, is just one of the more well-known episodes. The use of Agent Orange, a toxic herbicide that poisoned millions of people and devastated the environment, is another dark legacy of this conflict. The American media, controlled by the government and powerful corporations, covered up much of these atrocities. It was only when independent journalists began to release images of the horrors of the war that the American public turned against the conflict, leading to mass protests on the streets. After years of fighting and countless deaths, the United States was forced to withdraw from Vietnam. The country had spent billions of dollars, destroyed entire cities, and lost over 58,000 soldiers, only to see Vietnam reunified under a communist government. The Vietnam War was a farce, sustained by lies, economic interests, and media manipulation. The suffering of the Vietnamese people and American soldiers was the price paid to fuel the war machine and the profits of the global elite. Vietnam was not a strategic error, but a premeditated deception. The war was never about freedom or ideology. It was about power, money, and domination. And like so many other wars throughout history, it was sold to the public under the guise of a noble struggle. Unfortunately, the same patterns are repeating. New wars are fought with questionable justifications, and the truth is once again buried beneath the weight of official narratives. The Vietnam War teaches us a fundamental lesson: never accept history without questioning it. First fact, conspiracy theories that became real for centuries. Humanity has been fascinated by conspiracies. Many are seen as paranoid delusions, the product of restless minds that see patterns where none exist. But in certain cases, the line between fiction and reality dissolves, revealing truths that, in other times, were dismissed as madness. For years, the idea that the United States government conducted secret experiments to control the mind seemed like something out of a science fiction novel. However, the declassified documents of the MKUltra project revealed that between the 1950s and 1970s, the CIA did indeed conduct mind manipulation experiments on both American and foreign citizens. Hallucinogenic substances, psychological torture, and hypnotic techniques were used in an attempt to create programmed spies. What was once just a rumor became one of the largest scandals in U.S. intelligence history. When Edward Snowden revealed the world the PRISM program of the U.S. National Security Agency (NSA, many were shocked. The idea that governments were spying on their own populations, intercepting private communications on a massive scale, was considered an absurd conspiracy theory. However, the leaked documents proved that this practice was real, encompassing world leaders, ordinary citizens, and private companies. What once seemed like paranoia became one of the largest privacy violations in modern history. For decades, it was believed that the major tobacco corporations were unaware of the fatal risks of smoking. However, internal documents revealed that since the 1950s, these companies knew about the harmful effects of nicotine and chemical additives, but hid this information from the public. They funded false research, pressured scientists, and manipulated advertising campaigns to maintain profitability. The result? Millions of deaths that could have been avoided. Conspiracy theories are not always baseless delusions. Some have proven to be real, uncovering schemes of manipulation, surveillance, and control that seemed unimaginable. What these stories teach us is that healthy skepticism is essential. We must question, investigate, and never blindly accept official narratives. After all, what may seem like a conspiracy theory today could be the truth of tomorrow.